Everyone treats Peter Griffin as harmless, a goofy dad, a lovable idiot, good for a laugh, and nothing more. Family Guy has trained people to forgive him before the joke even lands. 10 different episodes tell a completely different story. In this video, we break down every time Peter Griffin was the worst dad ever. The picture Peter made her. Take. Family Guy has never pretended that Peter Griffin is a good father. But the episode Not All Dogs Go to Heaven, which aired on Fox on March 29, 2009, shows exactly how far his carelessness can go. It starts with something as small as a photograph at a convention and ends with his own daughter locked in her room, sick, alone, and left to figure out the world on her own terms because nobody else in the house bothered to help her. This is a story about a father who had one simple job to do years earlier, never did it, and then made things worse the moment his daughter actually got hurt because of it. Quahog, the fictional town where the Griffin family lives, holds an annual Star Trek convention. It is one of those town events that pulls in fans from all over, filled with costumes, actors from the original show, and grown adults dressed as their favorite characters. The Griffins go every year, and Stewie, the baby of the family, is obsessed with the cast of Star Trek: The Next Generation. He spends the episode trying to get close enough to ask them real questions, and when that fails, he builds a machine in his room that beams the actual actors into the house. That part of the story runs alongside the main plot, but it matters here because it shows how normal a day at this convention is supposed to be. It is supposed to be fun. It is supposed to be safe. Instead, it becomes the reason Meg spends the next several days in bed, sick and miserable, because of one decision her father makes without thinking twice. While walking through the convention, Peter spots a man who looks like he is dressed as some kind of alien creature, with a swollen face and puffed-out cheeks. Excited, Peter grabs Meg and pushes her toward him, insisting she pose for a picture next to what he assumes is an incredibly detailed costume. It is not a costume. The man is not dressed up at all. He actually has the mumps, a real illness that causes the face and glands to swell up, and he is out in public around hundreds of people despite being sick and contagious. Peter has no idea, and worse, he does not care enough to check. He just wants the photo. He pushes his daughter into close contact with a stranger without a single thought about whether it might be dangerous, because in his mind, it is just a fun moment at a convention, not a real risk to his own child. That single decision becomes the whole reason for everything that follows, and it connects to something that happened long before this episode ever aired. Meg was never given a mumps vaccine as a child. It is a basic shot that most kids get early in life, specifically so this kind of thing cannot happen. Somewhere along the way, whether from neglect, forgetfulness, or simply not caring enough to schedule it, Peter and Lois never got Meg vaccinated. That gap in her medical care, something that should have been handled when she was a baby, is what turns a bad photo op into a serious illness. Meg gets infected with the mumps because of a decision, or lack of one, that was made by her parents long before she could even understand what a vaccine was. She had no say in it. She just had to live with the consequences years later, stuck in bed with a swollen face and a fever, while the rest of the household barely blinks. Setting the stage for how badly this family fails her requires looking at how the Griffins already treat Meg before she even gets sick. Across the show, Meg is consistently treated as the least important person in the house. She is mocked, ignored, and pushed aside in almost every episode, and this one starts no differently. Even before the mumps show up, nobody in the family seems to think much of her feelings or her physical safety. Peter drags her along to the convention, not because he wants to spend time with her, but because she happens to be standing nearby when he wants a photo taken. She is treated less like a daughter and more like a prop he can grab and use whenever it is convenient for him. That mindset, The idea that Meg exists to serve whatever Peter wants in the moment is the entire reason she ends up sick in the first place. The tension builds quickly once Meg starts to feel the effects of the illness. Her face begins to swell, she runs a fever, and she becomes weak enough that she has to stay home from school and spend her days in bed. This is where the real problem starts to show itself, because a sick child in any normal home would get comfort, care, and attention from a parent. Instead, Meg gets a television placed in her room, so she has something to do while she recovers. That would sound like a normal, even kind gesture, except for one detail that reveals exactly how little thought went into it. The television only picks up one channel, and that channel happens to be a religious broadcast station featuring a well-known television preacher. Nobody checks whether the television works properly. Nobody makes sure she has anything else to watch, read, or do. She is handed a broken source of entertainment and left completely alone with it for days on end while she suffers through a painful illness that could have been avoided entirely with one shot she should have received as a baby. Being isolated with nothing but a single religious channel for days at a time has a huge effect on a bored, sick, and lonely teenage girl who is desperate for any kind of connection or comfort. She starts watching the preacher on the screen, a charismatic man who talks about faith, salvation, and a personal relationship with God. With nothing else to occupy her mind and nobody checking in on her in any meaningful way, Meg becomes completely absorbed in what she is watching. Over the course of just a few days in bed, she transforms from a regular teenage girl into a devoted, born-again Christian, convinced that she has found real meaning and purpose in her life for the first time. She throws herself into her new faith with total intensity, the kind of intensity that only comes from someone who has been starving for attention, structure, and belonging in a house that gives her none of those things. Her sudden religious transformation is not really about faith on its own. It comes directly from being left alone, sick, and unsupervised, with nothing else to fill the silence. The high moment of this story arrives when Meg's newfound faith collides directly with her own family, specifically with Brian, the family dog, who can talk, drink, and reason like any adult in the house. As Meg recovers and returns to normal life, she becomes determined to spread her new beliefs to everyone around her, and Brian becomes her main target. During one of her attempts to convert him, Brian reveals something he has apparently kept quiet for a long time. He tells Meg, in no uncertain terms, that he does not believe in God at all. He is an atheist, and he has no interest in being converted to anything. This revelation stuns everyone in the family, since Brian had never openly discussed his lack of faith before this moment. For a household that already leans religious, at least on the surface, Brian's admission feels like a small earthquake. But it is Meg's reaction and what she does with that information that turns a private disagreement into a public disaster. Rather than accepting that Brian has different beliefs and moving on, Meg becomes fixated on the idea that his atheism is a problem that needs to be exposed. She decides to tell the media about it, going public with the fact that the Griffin family dog does not believe in God. This decision sets off a chain reaction across the entire town of Quahog. News of Brian's atheism spreads fast, and the reaction from the town is anything but understanding. People who once saw Brian as just another member of the community suddenly turn on him with open hostility. He becomes a target of public anger, treated less like a pet and more like an enemy of the town's values. The backlash escalates to the point where residents organize a book burning, destroying material connected to atheism and secular thinking in a dramatic show of rejection. Brian, who was simply living his life with his own private beliefs, suddenly finds himself facing real consequences just for being honest when Meg pushed him for an answer. What makes this moment especially telling is where Peter is during all of this chaos. His daughter has gone from a quiet, ignored teenager to the center of a religious firestorm that is tearing apart the town's relationship with the family dog, and Peter is nowhere to be found as any kind of guiding presence. He does not step in to talk to Meg about respecting other people's beliefs. He does not try to calm the situation down or help Brian deal with the sudden hatred directed at him. He simply lets the entire disaster play out around him, treating it as background noise rather than a genuine family crisis caused, in part, by his own neglect. The illness that started this entire chain of events traces back to his careless decision at the convention, and the isolation that turned Meg into an intense religious convert traces back to nobody bothering to give her a working television or any real attention while she was sick. Yet, through all of it, Peter remains completely disconnected from the consequences of his own actions, treating the fallout as something that simply happens to other people in his house, rather than something he had a direct hand in creating. The fallout from Meg's public exposure of Brian's beliefs grows more serious as the days go on. Brian becomes isolated from the community, treated as an outsider in a town that once welcomed him without question. He finds himself desperate to fix his reputation and regain any kind of normal life, eventually resorting to pretending he has changed his mind about God, just so he can be allowed back into public spaces, including being served alcohol at local establishments that had started refusing him service because of his atheism. This fake conversion is entirely about survival, not sincerity, and it shows just how extreme the town's reaction has become. Meanwhile, Meg continues pushing her new beliefs onto everyone around her with the same intensity she showed when she first discovered them, seemingly unaware or unconcerned about the damage her actions have caused to someone she claims to care about as part of her own family. It eventually falls to Brian, not Peter, not Lois, and not anyone who is supposed to be a responsible adult figure in Meg's life, to try to talk some sense into her. In a private conversation, Brian challenges Meg directly, pointing out how her sudden faith seemed to arrive out of nowhere, and pushing her to think honestly about why she latched onto it so hard in the first place. He forces her to confront the idea that her conversion had less to do with genuine belief and more to do with loneliness, boredom, and a desperate need for something, anything, to hold on to while she was stuck alone in her room. This conversation becomes the turning point that finally gets through to her, and she begins to step back from her intense religious crusade, recognizing that she went too far in trying to force her beliefs onto people who never asked for them. It is a strange twist that the family dog, rather than either of her parents, ends up being the one who actually helps her process what happened to her, showing just how absent Peter and Lois are from their own daughter's emotional well-being throughout the entire ordeal. Looking at the bigger picture, this episode captures something that repeats constantly throughout the show's history. Peter creates a problem through simple carelessness. In this case, forcing his daughter into contact with a sick stranger and never having bothered to get her a basic childhood vaccine, and then completely disappears when that problem grows into something much larger and more damaging. He does not comfort Meg when she is physically sick. He does not notice or care that she has been left alone with a broken television for days on end. He does not step in when her isolation turns into an obsession that ends up hurting someone else in the household. Every single consequence in this story flows directly from decisions Peter either made carelessly or failed to make at all. Yet he walks away from the entire episode without facing any real reckoning for his part in it. This pattern matters because it shows that Peter's failures as a father are not always loud or dramatic in the moment they happen. Sometimes they are as small and quiet as forgetting to schedule a vaccine appointment or handing a sick child a broken television instead of actual company. Those small failures do not disappear just because they seem minor at the time. They build on each other, growing into much bigger problems down the line. whether that means a serious illness, a dangerous public backlash against someone in the household, or a daughter who spirals into an extreme new belief system simply because nobody was paying enough attention to notice she needed something else instead. Peter's negligence in this episode is not a single bad choice. It is a chain of small failures that started years earlier and kept building until it exploded into a town-wide controversy that had nothing to do with Meg's actual well-being and everything to do with how little support she received when she needed it most. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That missed vaccine turned out to be the quiet root of everything that followed, a detail nobody even mentioned once the chaos with Brian and the town took over. It would not be the last time something this small cost one of his kids so much. The next time, there would be no photograph and no illness involved at all. Just a debt Peter created on his own, and a solution that turned his own daughter into a way to make it disappear. Section 2. The debt he paid with his daughter. Family Guy has shown plenty of moments where Peter Griffin puts his own comfort ahead of his family, but few episodes make that point as clearly as 8 Simple Rules for Buying My Teenage Daughter, which aired on Fox on July 10, 2005. This episode takes a normal errand, a trip to buy condoms, and turns it into a story where Peter racks up a massive debt through pure carelessness, and then decides the easiest way to pay it off is to hand over his own daughter as payment. It is one of the clearest examples in the entire show of Peter treating Meg less like a person with her own life and more like an object he can trade away the moment it becomes convenient for him. The episode opens with Peter heading to the local pharmacy, run by a man named Mort Goldman, to pick up condoms. When he gets to the counter, he realizes he left his wallet at home and has no way to pay. Rather than turning around, coming back later, or asking to borrow a small amount of cash, Peter accepts an offer from Mort to open a running tab at the store. This is where the trouble starts, because giving Peter access to unlimited credit at a pharmacy is basically giving him permission to spend without any real limit or plan. Almost immediately, he starts buying things he does not need. Among his more pointless purchases is a large supply of a medicine used to make people throw up, which he buys specifically so he can hold a vomiting contest with Brian, Chris, and Stewie. The contest itself goes badly for everyone involved, since the medicine turns out to be far stronger than any of them expected. But the real damage is financial. By spending on impulse with no plan to pay any of it back, Peter allows his tab at the pharmacy to grow into a debt of $34,000. An amount so large that Mort eventually has no choice but to call it in and demand payment. Setting the stage for what happens next requires looking at how little thought Peter puts into either the spending or the consequences. He does not treat the tab as real money he owes. He treats it like a game, buying things for his own entertainment without stopping to consider what it will cost him later. This kind of thinking shows up again and again throughout the show, where Peter makes decisions based entirely on what feels fun or interesting in the moment, with zero concern for how those choices will affect the people around him. In this case, the person who ends up paying the real price for his carelessness is not Peter himself. It is Meg, who had nothing to do with the debt, never spent a cent of it, and had no say in how it was created, yet becomes the one forced to deal with the fallout the moment Peter needs a fast way out. The rising tension in this story comes from the fact that Peter does not even have to search hard for a solution once the debt becomes serious. Mort has a son named Neil, a socially awkward teenager who has been infatuated with Meg for months, watching her from a distance and clearly hoping for any chance to be close to her. Peter notices this existing obsession and sees it as an opportunity rather than a warning sign. Instead of feeling uncomfortable about a boy fixating on his daughter for that long, Peter treats it as the perfect way to make his debt disappear. He goes to Mort with an offer, proposing that Meg become Neil's girlfriend under a signed contract in exchange for wiping out the $34,000 Peter owes. Mort agrees to the arrangement, and just like that, Peter has settled his financial mess by using his own daughter as the payment without asking Meg a single question about how she feels about any of it. The high moment of the episode arrives once the contract goes into effect, and Meg's life is suddenly controlled by a piece of paper her father signed on her behalf. Under the terms of the deal, Meg is essentially placed under Neil's ownership, expected to serve as his girlfriend regardless of her own wishes. The full weight of the arrangement becomes clear when Meg is put to work doing hard physical labor on the Goldman family's property, plowing a field in their front yard like an employee rather than someone's daughter. This detail makes the transaction feel even more like an ownership deal than a normal, if strange, arranged relationship. She is not just expected to date Neil, she is expected to perform physical work for his family, treated as property that now belongs to the Goldmans because her own father signed her away to cover his own irresponsible spending. What makes this story even more revealing about Peter's mindset is what happens once Lois finds out what he has done. She is furious, and rightly so, confronting him directly about how he could possibly try to sell their own daughter to settle a debt he created entirely on his own. This reaction from Lois shows that even within the Griffin household, where bad behavior is common, selling a child crosses a line that even she recognizes as shocking. Yet, Peter's response to her anger says just as much about him as the original decision did. Rather than showing real remorse or trying to fix the situation immediately, he responds to Lois's fury with a greeting card, one he apparently searched hard to find, that simply reads a short apology for trying to sell their daughter. The fact that a card like this exists at all, and that Peter would think handing it over solves the problem, shows how little he actually understands about the seriousness of what he did. He treats a decision that turned his daughter into a bargaining chip as something that can be smoothed over with a joke printed on a small piece of cardstock, rather than something that requires real accountability or a genuine effort to undo the damage. The fallout from the contract becomes more complicated once Neil's attention starts to shift elsewhere. Despite being the one who pushed so hard for this arrangement in the first place, Neil begins dating another girl, seemingly losing interest in Meg almost as quickly as he pursued her. This sudden change catches Meg off guard in an unexpected way. Rather than feeling relieved to be free of an arrangement she never agreed to in the first place, she becomes jealous, upset that the boy who was once obsessed with her now seems to want someone else. This reaction pushes her into actively trying to win back the attention of a boy who essentially owned her under a contract her own father created, which says a lot about how confused and desperate the entire situation has made her feel about her own worth and her place in these kinds of relationships. She goes looking for a boyfriend of her own to make Neil jealous in return, eventually settling for a boy who mostly just wants her to spend money on him, showing that even her attempt to find something real for herself ends up being just another one-sided arrangement. Eventually, Meg decides she wants to prove her sincerity to Neil and signs the original contract herself, fully agreeing to the arrangement that Peter set up without her permission in the first place. This decision leads directly to her being put to work on the Goldman property, plowing the field as part of what the contract demands from her. It is only through Brian, the family dog, that any real solution to this mess comes into view. Brian discovers a clause buried in the contract stating that the entire agreement becomes void if Neil is ever unfaithful to Meg. This discovery gives the family a way out, but the plan Peter and Lois come up with to use that clause says just as much about their judgment as the original deal did. Rather than sitting down with Meg or trying to end the arrangement honestly, Lois dresses up as a comic book character in an elaborate disguise and attempts to seduce Neil at a fake convention set up specifically to trick him into being unfaithful. It is a strange and roundabout scheme, but it does work. Neil is caught in a compromising moment, which technically breaks the contract's terms. The resolution of this storyline comes with an unexpected turn, since Neil, once confronted with what happened, does not react with anger or embarrassment. Instead, he tells Meg that he only wants to be with her if she genuinely wants to be with him too, not because of a contract or an obligation forced onto her. He tears up the agreement himself and chooses to return to his previous girlfriend, showing a level of self-awareness and decency that neither Peter nor the overall situation had given him credit for. In a strange way, Neil ends up being the one person in this entire mess who treats Meg's feelings as something that actually matters, even though he was the one who wanted the arrangement in the first place. He recognizes that forcing someone into a relationship through a contract is not something worth holding on to, a realization that Peter never seems to reach about his own decision to create that contract to begin with. Looking at the bigger picture this episode leaves behind, the entire situation traces back to one simple truth about how Peter operates as a father. He created a financial problem through pure carelessness, buying things he did not need with money he did not have. And the moment that problem became serious, his first instinct was to look for the fastest way out rather than the right way out. Using his own daughter as payment was not a decision made out of desperation after trying everything else. It was the very first option he considered, chosen specifically because it was easy and required nothing from him personally. He did not have to work extra hours, cut back on spending, or find another way to pay off what he owed. He simply handed over his daughter's autonomy to someone else and considered the matter settled. This pattern reveals something consistent about how little Peter separates his own convenience from his responsibilities as a father. Meg's feelings, her comfort, and her right to choose who she spends time with never factor into his decision-making process at any point in this story. She only becomes a consideration once Lois gets angry enough to force a conversation about it, and even then, Peter's response is a joke rather than genuine remorse. The debt gets settled. The contract eventually falls apart because of Neil's own decision, rather than any real effort from Peter to fix his mistake. And life in the Griffin household moves on as though nothing serious happened at all. Meg is left having gone through an experience where her own father decided her personal life and physical labor were fair trade for his own irresponsible spending. And no one in the family treats this as something that requires a real conversation or a lasting change in how Peter behaves going forward. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The debt was gone, the contract was torn up, and the entire ordeal faded into the background of daily life at the Griffin house almost as quickly as it began. But treating his daughter like a way to erase his own mess would not stay confined to a pharmacy tab and a boy with a crush. The next time Peter put Meg in that same position, there would be no contract and no negotiation involved at all. It would happen during a moment of real danger inside their own home, and instead of protecting her, he would find a way to use her just the same. Section 3. The Sandwich in the Middle of a Break-In. The episode, The Griffin Family History, which aired on Fox on May 14, 2006, gives one of the clearest pictures of how little Peter Griffin thinks about his daughter's safety even when real danger is standing inside his own house. This is not a story about carelessness that leads to a slow buildup of consequences over days or weeks. This is a story about a break-in, armed strangers inside the Griffin home, and a father who spends the middle of that crisis worrying about food instead of protecting his family. It shows a different side of Peter's neglect toward Meg, one where the danger is immediate and obvious. Yet he still finds a way to put his own comfort ahead of her safety. The episode centers on the Griffin family tracing back their history after a strange series of events. But the section of the story that matters most here involves a home invasion that puts the entire family at risk. Two robbers break into the Griffin house while everyone is inside, forcing the family to react quickly to protect themselves from armed strangers who have no reason to treat any of them kindly. In most households, a moment like this would call for calm thinking, quick decisions, and a focus on getting everyone to safety as fast as possible. The Griffins do have a panic room built into their house, a small hidden space meant to keep the family protected during exactly this kind of emergency. Once the robbers make their way inside, Peter and the rest of the family retreat into this room, sealing themselves away from the danger outside the door. Being safely locked away inside a panic room should be the end of the immediate danger, at least for the moment, giving the family time to figure out their next move without direct exposure to the robbers. Instead, Peter almost immediately creates a brand new problem by deciding that someone needs to leave the safety of that room to get help. Rather than thinking about who might be best suited for this task, or whether it is even necessary in the first place, Peter decides that Meg is the one who should go. He does not ask for volunteers or discuss it as a family decision. He simply picks his daughter to be the one who takes on the risk, sending her through a narrow ventilation duct that runs through the walls of the house, a tight and uncomfortable space clearly meant for airflow rather than for a person to crawl through during an emergency. Setting the stage for why this decision feels so wrong requires understanding what a panic room is supposed to represent within the story. It exists as the one place in the house where the family is supposed to be protected, no matter what happens outside its walls. Choosing to leave that protection at all is already a serious risk. But choosing to send a teenage girl out through a vent into a house where armed robbers are actively present shows just how little weight her safety carries in Peter's mind compared to whatever goal he has in sending her out there in the first place. He is not sending her out to escape and get real help from outside, at least not in the way that decision unfolds. He has something much smaller and more selfish in mind. Rising tension builds once Meg actually makes it through the vent and reaches a phone, the tool she was supposedly sent to retrieve in order to call for outside help during the break-in. This moment should represent her one useful contribution to the family's safety, a small victory that could lead to police arriving and the danger finally coming to an end. Instead, Peter takes this moment and turns it into an opportunity to have his own needs met. Rather than telling her to call for help immediately, he instructs her to make him a sandwich while she is out there. The request itself is almost impossible to take seriously given the circumstances, since Meg is in a genuinely dangerous position, crawling through tight spaces in a house with armed intruders. Yet her father's priority in that moment is food, rather than her safety or the safety of anyone else hiding in the panic room. The high moment of this story comes when Peter takes his lack of concern even further by using the house's loudspeaker system to announce Meg's exact location out loud, rather than staying quiet about where she is, which would be the obvious move if there is any real concern that robbers might hear and go looking for her. Peter broadcasts her position for seemingly no good reason at all. He does this not as part of any plan to protect her or distract the robbers, but simply because he wants to tell the rest of the family's stories while they wait things out in the panic room, treating the entire situation as an opportunity for casual conversation rather than a serious threat to his daughter's life. Announcing her location turns what was already a risky task into something far more dangerous, since now anyone in the house, including the robbers, would know exactly where to find her if they happened to be listening. What makes this moment stand out, even among all the other examples of Peter's neglect throughout the show, is how unnecessary the danger is. He is not forced into announcing Meg's location by any outside pressure or trick. He does it on his own, seemingly without thinking about what it might mean for her safety, because his mind is occupied with entertaining the rest of the family rather than protecting the one member of the family he sent out into danger in the first place. The entire sequence reveals a pattern where Peter treats real threats to Meg's life as background noise, something happening off to the side while he focuses on whatever feels more interesting or convenient to him in the moment. The fallout from this decision plays out with Meg somehow managing to survive the ordeal despite everything working against her safety throughout the entire sequence. She makes it through the vent, retrieves the phone, gets treated like a delivery service for her father's hunger, and has her location broadcast to the whole house. Yet the story moves forward without anyone in the family stopping to reflect on how badly this could have gone. There is no real conversation about how dangerous the situation was, how wrong it was to send a teenage girl out into an active break-in instead of an adult, or how careless it was to announce her hiding spot over a loudspeaker while robbers were still somewhere in the house. The danger simply passes, and life continues as though sending Meg into that kind of risk was a completely normal decision to make during a family emergency. Zooming out from this single moment reveals something important about how Peter approaches Meg's role within the family whenever real trouble shows up. She is not treated as someone who needs protection during a crisis, the way a parent would normally think about a child in genuine danger. She is treated as a tool, someone useful for completing small tasks that Peter does not want to handle himself. Sending her through the vent to get the phone is one thing, since at least that action is connected to helping the family during the break-in. But turning that same trip into an errand for food, then broadcasting her exact position for no clear reason at all, shows that Peter's thinking shifts almost immediately from using Meg to help the family to using her to serve his own personal comfort, even while actual danger is still present in the house. This pattern connects to something seen consistently throughout the show, where Meg's usefulness to the family often becomes more important to Peter than her actual well-being. In this story, that usefulness takes the form of physical tasks completed during a dangerous situation. First, retrieving a phone and then making a sandwich, both treated with roughly the same level of importance in Peter's mind, despite one of those tasks being genuinely necessary and the other being nothing more than a selfish request made at the worst possible time. The fact that he does not distinguish between these two tasks, treating an actual emergency response and a personal food order as equally reasonable things to ask of his daughter while she is in physical danger, says a great deal about how little separation exists in his mind between what Meg is supposed to do for the family and what she is expected to do for him personally. Looking closely at the loudspeaker moment also reveals something about how little thought Peter gives to consequences before acting. He does not appear to weigh the risk of announcing Meg's location against any potential benefit of doing so. There is no strategic reason given for why he makes this choice. He simply does it, seemingly because it occurs to him in the moment, and he does not stop to consider whether it might put his daughter in greater danger. This kind of impulsive decision-making shows up again and again throughout Peter's actions across many different situations in the show, where he reacts to whatever feels interesting or convenient at a given second without pausing to think about how his choices might affect the people around him, especially Meg. The broader picture that this episode paints is one where a father repeatedly puts his daughter into avoidable danger, not out of any specific cruelty toward her as an individual, but simply because he does not think about her safety as something that requires real attention or care. Sending her into the vent, asking for food while she is in the middle of a dangerous task, and announcing her location for no clear reason are three separate decisions made one after another, each one adding another layer of risk to a situation that already involved armed robbers inside the family home. None of these choices come from malice in any direct sense. They come from a complete lack of awareness about how serious the situation actually is, and how much responsibility a father is supposed to feel toward protecting his child during a moment like this. This particular story stands apart from other examples of Peter's neglect because the danger here is immediate and physical, rather than something that builds slowly over time. A missed vaccine or a debt racked up through careless spending both take time to turn into serious problems. A home invasion with armed robbers inside the house presents danger right away, in real time, with no room for delay or slow consequences. Peter's response to that kind of immediate danger, choosing to send his daughter into it while worrying about food and broadcasting her location without a second thought, shows that even when the stakes are as high and as obvious as they can possibly get, his priorities still do not shift toward protecting the people who depend on him. If anything, the casualness with which he treats Meg's safety during an actual break-in makes his usual neglect look even more troubling, since it shows this is not a pattern reserved only for smaller, everyday problems. It shows up just as strongly and just as carelessly, even when real physical harm is a genuine possibility standing just outside a locked door. The robbers eventually leave, the family comes out of the panic room, and the house returns to its usual routine as though nothing particularly alarming happened at all. Meg survives the vent, the sandwich request, and the announcement of her location, but none of it leads to any real change in how Peter treats her going forward. The break-in fades into memory, just like every other moment where her safety was treated as optional rather than essential. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same willingness to treat Meg's body as nothing more than a tool for solving a problem would not stay confined to a vent and a sandwich request. Not long after, an entirely different kind of household disaster would turn her into something even stranger. A passageway the rest of the family would use without a second thought, all because Peter could not resist digging up something he should have left buried in the ground. Section 4. The skull Peter would not put down. The episode Petergeist, which aired on Fox on May 7, 2006, starts with something small and competitive between neighbors and ends with the entire Griffin family losing their house, all because Peter could not resist digging up something that was never his to touch in the first place. This is a story about disrespect, about a father who ignores every warning given to him, and about how his own stubborn behavior eventually turns his daughter into something closer to a piece of furniture than a person during the chaos that follows. The trouble starts because of Joe Swanson, the Griffin's neighbor, who buys a new home theater system for his house. Peter, always eager to outdo the people around him, decides he needs to build something even bigger and better in his own backyard. Rather than settling for a similar home theater setup, Peter sets his sights on constructing an entire multiplex, a full-sized building meant to hold multiple movie screens right behind his house. This idea alone shows the kind of thinking that gets Peter into trouble throughout the show, since a normal response to a neighbor's new television system would not involve building an entire structure just to prove a point. But Peter commits to the plan anyway, purely out of a desire to have something bigger than what Joe has. While digging in his backyard to make room for this new construction project, Peter comes across something that should have stopped the entire plan immediately. He unearths a human skull, which turns out to belong to a Native American chief buried on that land long before the Griffins ever lived there. Finding human remains buried in the ground is not a small or ordinary discovery. It is the kind of thing that calls for respect, caution, and proper handling, since these remains belong to someone who lived, died, and was laid to rest on that spot long before Peter's backyard project ever existed. Brian, the family dog, immediately understands the seriousness of what Peter has found and urges him to put the skull back where it belongs, treating the discovery with the kind of respect that a normal person would recognize as necessary the moment human remains are involved. Peter, however, does not share any of that concern. Rather than reburying the skull or treating it with any dignity, he decides to keep it, holding on to it purely as a novelty item, something interesting and unusual to play with, rather than a serious reminder that he has disturbed someone's final resting place. What follows is a string of disrespectful acts that Peter commits toward the skull, entirely for his own amusement. He plays with it like a toy, urinates in it, and even uses it in a way meant to protect a sensitive part of his body during physical activity. Each one of these actions treats human remains as nothing more than an object for his personal entertainment, ignoring every basic sense of respect that most people would understand instinctively the moment they realized what they were holding. Setting the stage for the disaster that follows requires understanding just how many chances Peter has to fix his mistake before things spiral out of control. Brian does not just mention his concern once and drop the subject. He continues pushing Peter to return the skull and stop treating it as some kind of plaything, recognizing early on that disturbing a burial site and disrespecting human remains is the kind of thing that tends to have serious consequences, at least within the strange logic of the show's world. Peter ignores every single one of these warnings, choosing instead to keep using the skull however he pleases, seemingly unable to take the situation seriously even after being told directly that what he is doing is wrong. The rising tension in this story builds once strange and frightening events start happening inside the Griffin house, beginning that very night. The house becomes the site of unsettling paranormal activity almost immediately after Peter disrespects the skull. Stewie starts talking to static on the television screen, as though something is speaking back to him through it. Kitchen furniture rearranges itself in impossible ways, with chairs and the refrigerator ending up stacked upside down on the kitchen table. Peter experiences something deeply unsettling himself, tearing at his own face until a completely different face is revealed underneath his skin. Chris becomes the target of frightening events as well, terrified by a menacing appearance from a well-known fast food mascot, and then attacked by a tree that seems to come alive with hostile intent. An experience so alarming that he needs to be rescued from it. Each of these events builds on the last, making it increasingly clear that something is deeply wrong inside the house, directly connected to what Peter dug up and refused to treat with any respect. Lois, for a while, remains in denial about what is happening, unwilling to fully accept that these strange events are connected to the skull or that anything supernatural is actually taking place inside her own home. That denial comes to an abrupt end the moment Stewie disappears entirely, pulled into his own closet and vanishing from the house without warning. This moment escalates the situation from strange and unsettling to genuinely frightening, since now an actual member of the family has been taken by whatever force has been causing all of these disturbances. The family can no longer treat what is happening as some kind of odd coincidence or minor annoyance. A real member of their household is missing, pulled into some kind of spiritual world connected directly to the skull Peter refuses to give up. The high moment of this story arrives once the family decides they need outside help to figure out how to get Stewie back, leading them to hire a spiritual medium capable of communicating with whatever exists on the other side of the closet Stewie disappeared into. Through this medium, the family learns something deeply strange and uncomfortable about how the spirit world connects to their own house. The entrance to that world sits inside Stewie's closet, but the exit, the only way back into the physical world from wherever Stewie has been taken, runs directly through Meg's body. Specifically, the family learns that the only way out of the spirit world leads through Meg, using her as the passage point between one world and the other. This detail alone reveals something troubling about how little consideration the family gives Meg, even in moments involving genuine supernatural danger. Rather than treating this discovery as something deeply strange and uncomfortable that requires sensitivity toward Meg's feelings about her own body being used this way, the family instead begins using the situation for entertainment. Before taking the crisis seriously enough to attempt an actual rescue, family members start playing around with the discovery, treating Meg's body as a kind of toy or attraction rather than focusing immediately on getting Stewie back to safety. Objects get pushed through the portal on one side just to watch them come out through Meg on the other end, turning what should be a serious and uncomfortable situation into something closer to a carnival game. Peter himself takes part in this behavior, putting his own head through the portal just to make jokes about coming out the other side through his daughter, treating an already strange and invasive situation as an opportunity for laughs rather than showing any concern about how deeply uncomfortable this entire arrangement clearly makes Meg feel. Meg's discomfort throughout this sequence is impossible to miss, since she visibly flinches every time someone or something passes through the portal connected to her body. That reaction alone should be enough to make anyone in the family stop and reconsider what they are doing, recognizing that this entire arrangement is deeply upsetting to her, regardless of how strange or supernatural the circumstances happen to be. Instead, her visible discomfort becomes just another part of the joke, something the family either fails to notice or simply chooses to ignore because they are having too much fun playing with this bizarre new discovery to worry about how it makes her feel. What makes this moment stand out even further is the timing of when the family actually gets serious about the crisis at hand. It is not the discomfort Meg experiences that finally pushes them toward real action. It takes Stewie remaining trapped for long enough that Lois finally decides enough time has passed and takes matters into her own hands, entering the portal herself to rescue him directly, rather than waiting any longer for him to find his own way out. This means that the family's period of treating Meg's body as an amusement park attraction lasts as long as it does simply because nobody feels enough urgency to stop, not because anyone recognizes how wrong the entire situation is for Meg specifically. The fallout from this entire chain of events escalates dramatically once Lois finally does rescue Stewie from the spirit world. Rather than the danger simply ending once he is safely back, the spirits connected to the disturbed burial ground grow enraged by everything that has happened, unleashing their fury directly on the Griffin house itself. The spirits ravage the home, tearing through it with destructive force before pulling the entire structure into their world, leaving the family homeless in an instant. What started as Peter's competitive desire to build something bigger than his neighbor's home theater system ends with his family losing their house entirely, a consequence far larger than anything he could have imagined when he first decided to dig in his own backyard. Homeless and desperate to fix the situation, Peter and Lois realize the only way to get their house and their normal life back is to properly rebury the skull in its original resting place, finally showing the kind of respect that Brian had been urging Peter to show from the very beginning of the story. This search leads them through the city dump, where they learn the skull was picked up and taken by a celebrity known for collecting unusual items to use as props. Getting the skull back requires the family to track this person down at their own home, leading to a chase through a hall of mirrors before they finally manage to retrieve it. Only after going through all of this trouble, losing their house and being forced into a frantic search across the city, does the family finally rebury the skull properly, restoring their home and returning their lives to some sense of normal. Looking at the bigger picture this episode leaves behind, the entire disaster traces back to one simple choice Peter made and then refused to reconsider even after being warned directly about the consequences. Digging up a burial site was already a serious mistake, but disrespecting the remains he found, choosing to treat human remains as a personal plaything rather than something requiring dignity and respect, turned a bad decision into a genuine catastrophe for his entire family. The house being pulled into another world and the family becoming homeless are consequences serious enough on their own, but the detail that stands out most within the context of how Peter treats his children involves what happens to Meg specifically during this crisis. Meg becomes, quite literally, a passageway that the rest of her family uses for their own entertainment during a moment of genuine danger involving her own brother. This is not a situation where she chooses to help in some uncomfortable way out of necessity. It is a situation created entirely by supernatural forces reacting to Peter's own careless behavior. Yet the burden of that consequence falls on her body specifically, and the family's first instinct is to treat that burden as a source of amusement rather than something requiring sensitivity or concern. Peter putting his own head through the portal just to joke about emerging from his daughter shows exactly how little his mind connects her physical discomfort to anything worth taking seriously, even in a moment involving actual supernatural danger to another one of his children. This pattern connects to something seen throughout many of Peter's interactions with Meg across different situations. Her body, her comfort, and her feelings consistently rank far below whatever entertainment or convenience the moment offers to the rest of the family. In this case, that pattern takes on a stranger and more unsettling form than usual, since the entertainment comes directly from treating a supernatural crisis, one caused entirely by Peter's own stubbornness, as an opportunity for jokes at Meg's expense, rather than a situation requiring immediate, respectful action. The house eventually returns, the family settles back into their normal routine, and life carries on as though nothing particularly troubling happened to Meg throughout the entire ordeal. No conversation follows about how uncomfortable the entire portal situation made her feel, and no acknowledgement ever comes from Peter about using his own daughter's body as a punchline while his son remained trapped in genuine danger. The disaster fades into memory, just like every other moment where her comfort took a back seat to everyone else's amusement. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same instinct to overlook Meg the moment real danger enters the picture would not stay confined to a haunted backyard and a strange portal. Before long, actual danger would find her directly, far from home, with no supernatural excuse involved at all. And the way Peter responded to hearing about it over the phone would turn out to be even harder to look past. Section 5. Dead already, according to her own father. The episode Lego My Mego, which aired on Fox on May 6, 2012, takes one of the most serious situations any parent could ever face, a child in real danger far from home, and shows Peter Griffin responding to it with almost no urgency at all. This episode borrows its basic setup from a well-known action movie about a kidnapped daughter and a father who will do anything to get her back, but flips that entire idea on its head. Instead of following a father who drops everything the moment he learns his daughter is in danger, this story follows one who barely reacts at all, leaving the real rescue effort to fall on two of the least likely members of the household. The story begins at Meg's school during gym class, where she is talking with her friend Ruth about how much she dislikes her life at school. The conversation shows just how unhappy Meg has become with her daily routine, wondering out loud whether she can even make it through the rest of the semester surrounded by classmates who treat her poorly. This detail matters because it sets up exactly why Meg decides to take the trip that eventually leads her into danger. She is not looking for trouble or adventure for its own sake. She is looking for a break from a life at home and at school, where she consistently feels unwanted, mistreated, and overlooked. The same pattern that shows up again and again throughout every part of her life connected to the Griffin household. Meg decides to travel with Ruth, leaving behind the environment that has made her so unhappy for a chance at something different, even if only for a short time. This decision reflects a kind of quiet desperation. A teenage girl choosing to put real distance between herself and a life where she rarely receives kindness or attention from the people who are supposed to care about her most. The trip starts as an exciting escape, offering Meg a taste of independence and adventure that her daily life back home simply does not provide. Setting the stage for the danger that follows requires recognizing how quickly this exciting escape turns into something far more serious. What begins as a fun trip away from home takes a sudden and frightening turn when Meg gets kidnapped, pulled into a genuinely dangerous situation while far from anyone who could easily reach her or help her right away. This moment shifts the entire story from something lighthearted into something that mirrors real fear and real danger, following the structure of the action movie it borrows from, where a father is expected to move heaven and earth the moment he learns his child has been taken. The rising tension in this story comes from the phone call that follows once news of the kidnapping reaches the family. Meg manages to get Peter on the phone while the kidnapping is actively happening, a moment that should represent her one chance to get real help from the person who is supposed to protect her more than anyone else in the world. In any normal situation, a father hearing his daughter's voice during an active kidnapping would react with total urgency, asking rapid questions, trying to gather any useful information, and doing everything possible to keep her calm and safe while help gets organized. Peter does none of this. Rather than treating the phone call as an emergency requiring his full attention and quick thinking, he offers little in the way of actual advice or support, responding to the situation with almost no sense of how serious it really is. The high moment of this story arrives immediately after that phone call ends, when Peter turns to Lois and, rather than organizing any kind of rescue effort or expressing real fear for his daughter's safety, simply announces that Meg is dead. There is no basis given for this conclusion beyond his own immediate assumption, made in the middle of an active crisis where Meg herself was still on the phone moments earlier. This single moment captures something deeply troubling about how little effort Peter puts into processing serious danger involving his own daughter. He does not attempt to gather more information, consider what steps might actually help her, or even hold on to any hope that she might still be alive and in need of real assistance. He jumps straight to the most final and hopeless conclusion possible, and then moves on from the conversation as though there is nothing left to be done. This reaction stands in sharp contrast to how the same kind of story usually plays out in the kind of movie this episode is directly parodying, where a father receives similar news and immediately becomes consumed with finding his daughter, refusing to accept anything less than getting her back safely, no matter what it takes. Peter's response flips that entire idea completely, showing a father who accepts the worst possible outcome without a fight, seemingly more comfortable assuming his daughter is already gone than doing the difficult work of trying to figure out how to save her. What makes this moment even more revealing is what happens next in the story. Since the real rescue effort does not come from Peter at all, it falls instead to Brian and Stewie, two members of the household who are not even Meg's parents, yet who take on the responsibility of trying to find her and bring her home safely. Brian and Stewie embark on what becomes an action-packed mission specifically aimed at locating Meg and getting her out of danger before it becomes too late. This detail matters enormously within the larger picture of how the Griffin family functions, since it shows that when a genuine crisis requires someone to step up and take real action, the person expected to lead that effort, the father of the family, checks out almost immediately, leaving the actual work of saving his daughter to the family dog and the baby. The fact that Brian and Stewie take on this mission with more seriousness and commitment than Peter ever shows throughout the entire episode says a great deal about where Peter's priorities actually sit when real danger threatens someone in his own family. Brian, despite being a dog, and Stewie, despite being an infant, both demonstrate more concern for Meg's safety and more willingness to take real action than her own father does after receiving direct news that she has been kidnapped. This role reversal, where the least likely members of the household step up, while the person most responsible for protecting Meg steps back entirely, forms the emotional core of what makes this story stand out among all the other examples of Peter's failures as a father. The fallout from Peter's immediate assumption that Meg is dead reveals itself through how the rest of the household continues to function around that belief, at least for a time, without any real push from Peter himself to investigate further or hold on to hope. While Brian and Stewie actively work toward finding and rescuing her, Peter's own contribution to the situation essentially ends the moment he decides she must already be gone. He does not appear to spend the rest of the episode desperately hoping for updates, pushing for more information, or doing anything that suggests he genuinely believes there might still be a chance to save her. His emotional investment in the crisis appears to end almost as quickly as it began, treating the worst possible outcome as a settled fact, rather than a fear that should push him toward action rather than resignation. This pattern connects to something seen consistently throughout the show whenever Meg faces real danger or hardship. Peter's first instinct rarely involves stepping up to protect her directly. Instead, his reactions tend to range from complete indifference to outright avoidance of any real responsibility for her safety or well-being. In earlier moments, that indifference showed up through carelessness, like forgetting a basic vaccine or treating her safety as secondary to his own comfort during a home invasion. In this story, that same indifference takes an even more extreme form, since he does not simply fail to protect her through carelessness. He essentially gives up on her entirely the moment real danger appears, accepting her apparent death without any fight or resistance, then leaving the actual work of saving her to two other members of the household who owe her far less as a matter of family responsibility than he does. Zooming out to consider what this episode reveals about Peter as a father, the most striking detail is not simply that he fails to help Meg during her kidnapping. It is how quickly and how completely he gives up on her the moment things become difficult or uncertain. A father who truly cared about his daughter's safety, even one who might struggle to know exactly what to do in a genuine emergency, would likely hold on to some hope, push for more information, or at least show visible distress over the possibility that something terrible has happened to his child. Peter's calm, almost casual acceptance of Meg's supposed death shows a level of emotional distance from her that goes beyond simple neglect. It suggests that somewhere in his mind, the possibility of losing his daughter does not carry the same weight it would for a parent who felt a real, active connection to her well-being on a daily basis. The eventual outcome of the story, with Brian and Stewie successfully working to rescue Meg from her kidnappers, only reinforces just how unnecessary Peter's immediate resignation truly was. If a dog and a baby, working together, managed to accomplish what an active parent should have been fighting for from the very first phone call, then Peter's decision to give up so quickly cannot be explained away as a reasonable reaction to an impossible situation. It stands instead as another clear example of how little effort he is willing to put in when it comes to protecting Meg, even when the stakes could not possibly be higher than an active kidnapping happening in real time. This story fits into a much larger pattern that continues to build across every situation Meg faces throughout the show. Whether the danger comes from a missed vaccine, a financial debt he created himself, a home invasion inside his own house, or a supernatural crisis caused by his own stubbornness, Peter consistently treats Meg's safety and well-being as something far less important than his own comfort or convenience. In this episode, that pattern reaches perhaps its most direct and uncomfortable form yet, since there is no confusion, no misunderstanding, and no distraction pulling his attention away from the crisis at hand. He hears directly that his daughter is in danger, and his response is to assume the worst without any real effort to change that outcome, leaving the job of actually saving her to family members who technically owe her nothing close to what a father is supposed to provide. Meg eventually returns home safely, thanks entirely to Brian and Stewie's efforts rather than anything her father contributes to the situation. Life at the Griffin house settles back into its usual routine once the danger passes, with no lasting conversation about how quickly Peter gave up on her, or what that decision revealed about how he actually views his responsibility toward her safety. The kidnapping fades into the background, just like every other crisis Meg has survived, despite her father's failure to show up for her when it mattered most. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same willingness to check out the moment things get difficult would not stay limited to phone calls and faraway danger. Before long, a threat would show up much closer to home, inside the walls of Meg's own school. And instead of stepping in to protect her from it directly, Peter would find himself far more consumed with a problem entirely of his own making, one that had nothing to do with keeping his daughter safe at all. Section 6. The Fight He Never Bothered to Stop. The episode A Fistful of Meg, which aired on Fox on November 10, 2013, places Meg in real physical danger from a classmate, while Peter spends almost the entire episode chasing something that has nothing to do with keeping her safe. This story shows a different kind of failure than the ones that came before it. It is not about carelessness that leads to an accident, or a debt that gets settled through a bad decision. It is about a father who has the chance to step in and protect his daughter from a genuine physical threat, and instead lets his own personal feud take up all of his attention, while she is left to handle a dangerous situation almost entirely on her own. The trouble starts at school, in gym class, where Meg accidentally bumps into a new student named Mike Pulaski. During the collision, she spills her lunch on him, an accident that would be minor and forgettable in most schools, but turns into something far more serious because of who Mike Pulaski happens to be. He is known around school as an unstable and aggressive student, someone other kids already avoid because of how unpredictable and dangerous he can be. Rather than accepting the accident for what it clearly is, Mike reacts with anger, threatening Meg with a physical fight after school as punishment for something that was never intentional in the first place. This threat sends a wave of fear through Meg almost immediately, since word of the planned fight spreads quickly through the school. Other students start talking about it, treating the upcoming confrontation as a major event, rather than something that should be stopped before it ever happens. Meg finds herself terrified, fully expecting that she has no real chance against someone with Mike's reputation for aggressive and unpredictable behavior. She becomes so convinced that this fight will end badly for her that she starts imagining her own funeral, picturing exactly how things might play out if she cannot find a way to avoid the confrontation entirely. Setting the stage for how little support Meg receives at home requires looking at what happens when she tries to find a way out of the fight through the school itself. She comes up with a plan to get herself expelled on purpose, believing that if she gets kicked out of school before the fight can happen, she will be safe from Mike entirely. This plan involves a personal video that ends up getting released publicly, something Meg hopes will be embarrassing enough to force the school to expel her immediately. The plan does not work the way she hopes, and she remains enrolled at the same school, still facing the exact same threat from Mike that she was trying so desperately to escape in the first place. With her plan to get expelled falling apart, Meg turns to her own mother for help, hoping that Lois might step in and allow her to transfer to a different school entirely, removing her from the danger without needing to fight anyone at all. This request represents a reasonable and simple solution to the entire problem, one that any parent genuinely concerned about their child's physical safety could easily grant without much difficulty. Lois, however, refuses to allow the transfer. Her reasoning has nothing to do with helping Meg build courage or face her problems directly. Instead, Lois refuses specifically because she does not want to deal with the hassle of fighting the school system or handling the process required to move Meg somewhere else. Meg's actual safety takes a back seat to her mother's unwillingness to deal with paperwork and logistics, showing that the neglect Meg experiences throughout this story does not come only from Peter, even though his own behavior throughout the episode ends up being far more central to the larger picture. The rising tension in this story builds through two separate paths happening at the same time within the Griffin household. On one side, Meg continues searching desperately for any way to avoid the fight with Mike, eventually finding an unlikely source of help in Glenn Quagmire, the family's neighbor. Rather than her own parents stepping in to protect her or teach her how to defend herself, it is Quagmire who offers genuine assistance, agreeing to help train Meg so she has some real chance of standing up to Mike when the fight finally happens. This detail alone reveals something important about where Meg finds actual support throughout this crisis. It does not come from Peter or Lois. It comes from someone outside the immediate family who simply decides to help because he recognizes she needs it. On the other side of the household, an entirely separate storyline unfolds involving Peter and Brian that ends up consuming almost all of Peter's attention throughout the episode. Peter has developed a habit of walking around the house completely naked, treating his own home as a place where he can do whatever he wants without any consideration for how it makes the people around him feel. Brian finds this behavior deeply uncomfortable and repeatedly tells Peter that he is not okay with it, but Peter dismisses these complaints entirely, insisting that since it is his own house, he has every right to be naked whenever he chooses, regardless of how anyone else feels about it. Rather than showing any willingness to compromise or consider Brian's discomfort, Peter continues the behavior, specifically because he knows it bothers Brian, turning it into a kind of ongoing power struggle between them. This conflict between Peter and Brian escalates throughout the episode, taking up significant time and attention within the household, running in parallel to Meg's desperate search for a way to survive her upcoming fight. Lois even becomes involved in this side conflict, helping Peter torment Brian further by tricking him into revealing his own body under the pretense that it will help him recover from the discomfort Peter has caused him, only for Peter to reveal that he hid his own naked body inside her robe as another way of continuing the joke at Brian's expense. The amount of energy the entire household pours into this ongoing feud between Peter and Brian stands in sharp contrast to the almost total lack of attention given to Meg's situation, where an actual physical threat from a dangerous classmate receives far less concern from her own parents than a dispute over nudity happening entirely for entertainment purposes within the house. The high moment of this story arrives on the day of the fight itself, when Meg finally has to face Mike Pulaski after all her attempts to avoid the confrontation have failed. Rather than being pulled from the situation by a parent who steps in at the last possible moment, or being denied the fight by school officials who recognize how dangerous it could be, Meg walks into this confrontation because nobody with real authority over the situation, whether at school or at home, does anything meaningful to stop it from happening. Principal Shepard, who oversees the school and who should be the one authority figure capable of shutting the entire fight down before it starts, instead does the opposite. Rather than intervening to protect a student from a threatened attack by another student known for aggressive and unpredictable behavior, the principal actively encourages the two of them to go through with the fight, treating a dangerous physical confrontation between students as something worth allowing rather than something that needs to be stopped immediately. This detail matters enormously within the larger picture of how many adults fail Meg throughout this single episode. Her own mother refuses to help her escape the situation through a school transfer. Her own father remains entirely consumed by a personal feud that has nothing to do with her safety. And the one person at school specifically responsible for keeping students safe from violence actively pushes the fight forward rather than stopping it. Meg walks into this confrontation almost entirely alone, having received real help only from a neighbor who chose to step in, despite having no obligation to do so at all. The fight itself unfolds with all the buildup and tension that comes from weeks of fear and anticipation. But the training Meg received from Quagmire ends up making a real difference in how she performs against Mike. Rather than simply losing badly, as she originally feared, Meg manages to defeat Mike Pulaski, turning what everyone expected to be a hopeless and one-sided fight into a genuine victory for her. This outcome carries real weight, specifically because of where her preparation came from. She did not develop the skills or confidence needed to win this fight because either of her parents stepped up to protect her or teach her how to handle the situation. She won because someone completely outside the immediate responsibilities of parenthood decided to fill in a gap that Peter and Lois left wide open. The fallout from Meg's victory involves the rest of the family celebrating the outcome, treating the entire situation as though it ended in a satisfying and light-hearted way now that the danger has passed. This celebration includes an event centered around eating food in large quantities, turning what had been a serious threat to Meg's physical safety into an excuse for the family to enjoy themselves once the crisis resolves in her favor. The shift from genuine danger to casual celebration happens quickly, without any real acknowledgement from Peter or Lois about how close this situation could have gone differently, or how little either of them actually did to help Meg through the weeks of fear leading up to the fight itself. Looking at the bigger picture this episode reveals, the most striking detail is not simply that Meg faces danger from a violent classmate. It is how completely disconnected her parents remain from that danger throughout the entire process leading up to the fight. Lois denies her a reasonable request to transfer schools purely out of personal convenience, choosing to avoid dealing with paperwork rather than protecting her daughter from a threat she is fully aware of. Peter, meanwhile, spends the episode locked in a self-centered conflict with Brian over his own behavior around the house, treating his own comfort and his desire to win a petty dispute as far more important than paying any attention to what his daughter is going through at school. This pattern connects directly to everything shown in earlier moments throughout Meg's life within this family. Whether the danger comes from a missed vaccine, a debt turned into a contract, a home invasion, a supernatural crisis, or a kidnapping far from home, the common thread running through every single one of these situations remains the same. Meg consistently ends up facing real danger with little to no meaningful support from either parent, forced instead to rely on herself or on outside help from people who technically owe her nothing close to what her own parents are supposed to provide. In this particular story, That outside help comes from a neighbor willing to spend real time and effort training her to defend herself, filling a role that should have belonged to her father or mother long before the day of the fight ever arrived. What makes Peter's role in this specific story stand out is how actively his attention gets pulled away from Meg's situation rather than simply drifting elsewhere through general carelessness. In earlier examples, his neglect often came from forgetting something important or failing to think through the consequences of a quick decision. Here, his neglect comes from actively choosing to pour his energy into a conflict of his own creation, one built entirely around his own comfort and his desire to keep annoying Brian regardless of how it makes anyone else feel. This means his attention is not simply absent from Meg's crisis by accident. It is occupied by something he chooses to prioritize over her, a distinction that makes his failure to notice or help with her situation feel even more deliberate than usual. The resolution of the fight itself, ending in Meg's unexpected victory, does not erase any of the neglect that led up to that moment. She still spent weeks living in genuine fear of a violent confrontation, with almost no meaningful support from the two people most responsible for her safety and well-being. The fact that things turned out well in the end, thanks entirely to help from someone outside her immediate family, does not change how little Peter or Lois contributed to getting her through that fear in the first place. If anything, the positive outcome makes their absence during the build-up even more noticeable, since it shows exactly what kind of support Meg could have received if either of her parents had chosen to step in the same way Quagmire did. This episode adds another layer to the picture of how Peter operates as a father, showing that his failures do not only appear through careless mistakes or selfish decisions made in the heat of a single moment. Sometimes his failures show up through simple absence, choosing to focus his attention on something entirely unrelated to his daughter's well-being, while a serious threat to her safety builds in the background without him even noticing it is happening. The naked feud with Brian may seem like nothing more than a strange side story running alongside Meg's fight with Mike, but the fact that it consumes so much of Peter's focus during the exact same period when his daughter needed real guidance and support says everything about where his priorities actually sit. Meg survives the fight, wins against Mike Pulaski, and life at the Griffin house returns to its usual rhythm almost immediately afterward. No real conversation follows about how frightened she was in the weeks leading up to that moment, or how little either of her parents did to help her through it. The crisis passes, celebrated with food and laughter, while the deeper problem underneath it, a household where Meg consistently has to find her own way through danger without real support from either parent, remains exactly the same as it was before the fight ever started. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same pattern of stepping back while someone else's household picks up the slack would not stay confined to schoolyard threats and personal feuds. Before long, a different kind of crisis would strike much closer to home, involving not Meg, but Stewie. And Peter's response to a genuine medical emergency inside his own house would reveal just how far he is willing to go to avoid taking real responsibility, even when a child's health is the one thing actually on the line. Section 7. The injury Peter chose to hide. The episode Brian Griffin's House of Pain, which aired on Fox on March 28, 2010, contains a storyline involving Stewie that shows one of the most alarming examples of Peter's parenting throughout the entire show. This is not a story about neglect through carelessness, or a father who simply fails to notice danger. This is a story about a father who discovers a serious medical emergency involving his own baby son, and chooses to hide it rather than get him real help, then makes the situation even more dangerous in an attempt to cover up what happened. The trouble begins with something that starts out as ordinary sibling roughhousing between Meg and Chris. Kids play rough with each other in almost every household, and on the surface, nothing about this moment seems especially unusual. Meg and Chris are simply being kids, moving around the house the way siblings often do when nobody is paying particularly close attention. The problem comes from where this roughhousing happens to take place. Meg and Chris end up near a staircase, and during their playing, Stewie gets caught in the middle of it. The two accidentally knock him down the stairs, sending the baby tumbling down a hard, unforgiving set of steps with no one there to catch him or stop the fall before it happens. Falling down an entire staircase is a serious event for anyone, but for a baby, the risk becomes far more severe. Babies have soft, still developing bodies, and a fall like this carries the potential for real, lasting harm. Once Meg and Chris realize what has happened, they discover that Stewie has suffered a serious injury to his head, a wound significant enough that it does not simply resolve itself with a little rest. The injury turns out to be severe enough that Stewie loses consciousness, and rather than waking up again within a few minutes or even a few hours, he remains unconscious for weeks. This detail alone shows just how serious the fall actually is. A brief moment of unconsciousness following a minor bump might be something a family could reasonably keep an eye on at home. But weeks of continuous unconsciousness point toward a medical emergency requiring real, professional attention, the kind that only a hospital and trained doctors can properly provide. Setting the stage for what happens next requires understanding the position Meg and Chris find themselves in immediately after the accident. They are the ones present when it happens, and rather than immediately rushing to get an adult involved or calling for outside help, they instead try to hide the fact that Stewie is now lying unconscious with a serious head injury. This decision on their part reflects something learned rather than something natural, since children generally do not develop an instinct to hide serious accidents from their parents unless they have learned through experience that honesty about mistakes in this household leads to consequences they would rather avoid. Meg and Chris attempt to conceal what happened, working together to keep the truth about Stewie's condition hidden from the rest of the family for as long as possible. The rising tension in this story builds once Peter eventually discovers what has actually happened to Stewie, uncovering the injury that Meg and Chris had been trying so hard to keep secret. This moment presents Peter with a clear and obvious choice. A baby in the house has suffered a severe head injury, serious enough to leave him unconscious for an extended period of time. Any reasonable parent facing this reality would understand immediately that professional medical care is not optional. A head injury this serious carries real risks, including the possibility of permanent damage or even death if left untreated. And the responsible choice in this moment is obvious. Stewie needs to go to a hospital, examined by doctors who can properly assess the extent of the damage and provide whatever treatment might be necessary to help him recover safely. Peter does not make this choice. Rather than rushing Stewie to a hospital the moment he discovers the injury, Peter instead decides to handle the situation himself, choosing to disguise himself and attempt to treat the wound on his own rather than seeking any kind of real medical help. This decision alone represents a serious failure in judgment, since Peter has no actual medical training or expertise that would qualify him to properly assess or treat a head injury this severe. Pretending to cover the wound himself, rather than bringing in someone with the knowledge and equipment necessary to treat it correctly, puts Stewie's health and safety at continued risk for every moment that passes without real medical attention. The reason behind Peter's strange decision to disguise himself while attempting this cover-up becomes clear once it comes out that this is not the first time something like this has happened in the Griffin household. Peter eventually confesses that he has handled situations like this before, admitting that he did the exact same thing to both Meg and Chris at some point in the past. This confession reveals something deeply troubling about how Peter approaches injuries within his own family. Rather than treating each new incident as a serious situation requiring real medical attention, he appears to have developed an established pattern of covering up injuries to his children rather than seeking proper help, treating concealment as his default response whenever something goes wrong under his watch. This detail changes the entire nature of what is happening in this story. Stewie's injury is not simply one isolated incident where Peter makes a single bad decision under pressure. It is part of an ongoing pattern that has apparently repeated itself multiple times across different children in the household, suggesting that Peter has never actually learned from these situations or changed his behavior after previous incidents involving Meg and Chris. Whatever happened during those earlier moments, serious enough that Peter felt the need to disguise himself and cover up the injuries rather than getting real help, clearly did not teach him anything about the importance of proper medical care when one of his children gets seriously hurt. The high moment of this story arrives once the cover-up begins to fall apart under its own weight. Attempting to hide a serious medical situation without any real medical training is not something that can realistically continue forever, especially when the injury involved is as significant as a head wound, serious enough to cause weeks of unconsciousness. As the situation drags on longer than Peter can reasonably manage on his own, the pressure to explain what happened to Stewie starts building, and Peter's response to that pressure reveals just how far he is willing to go to avoid taking real responsibility for what occurred. Rather than finally admitting the truth once the cover-up becomes unsustainable, Peter resorts to an extreme and genuinely dangerous solution in an attempt to shift blame away from himself and away from Meg and Chris entirely. He arranges a situation specifically designed to make Lois believe that she is the one responsible for Stewie's injury, engineering circumstances that lead to her unknowingly running her own baby over with the car. This decision stands as one of the most alarming choices Peter makes throughout the entire episode, since it involves deliberately putting Stewie in physical danger a second time, using an already injured baby as a tool to create a false explanation that removes responsibility from where it actually belongs. Understanding just how serious this decision is requires recognizing what Peter is actually doing here. Stewie is already suffering from a severe head injury, unconscious for weeks because of a fall that happened by accident during ordinary sibling play. Rather than accepting that reality and getting him real help, Peter deliberately creates a second dangerous situation, one involving an actual vehicle, specifically to construct a cover story that shifts blame onto Lois for something she never actually did. This means Stewie faces genuine physical danger not once, but twice within this single storyline, and the second instance is not an accident at all. It is a decision Peter makes on purpose, showing a level of calculated risk toward his own child's safety that goes well beyond simple carelessness or poor judgment made in a moment of panic. The fact that Peter would rather put Stewie in danger a second time than simply admit what happened and get him proper medical care reveals something deeply troubling about his priorities as a father. Protecting his own reputation or avoiding whatever consequences he fears might come from admitting the truth matters more to him in this moment than his son's actual physical safety. He is willing to risk making Stewie's condition even worse, using a car as part of an elaborate deception, purely to avoid having to take responsibility for what actually occurred. The fallout from this entire sequence of events involves Lois being manipulated into believing she caused harm to her own baby, carrying guilt for something she never actually did, while the real explanation remains hidden from her, because Peter chooses deception over honesty at every step along the way. This detail adds another layer to how many people in the household end up affected by Peter's decision to cover up Stewie's original injury, rather than handling it properly from the start. Lois becomes an unwitting participant in Peter's scheme, unknowingly playing a role in a cover-up she has no idea even exists, all because her husband decided that protecting himself mattered more than being honest with her about what actually happened to their son. Zooming out to consider the larger pattern this story reveals, the most striking detail is not simply that Peter fails to get Stewie proper medical care after a serious head injury. It is that this failure appears to be part of an established habit rather than an isolated lapse in judgment. His own admission that he did the same thing to Meg and Chris in the past suggests that this household has operated for a long time under an unspoken rule where serious injuries get hidden rather than treated, where Peter's instinct in a genuine emergency is concealment rather than seeking real help from people who are actually qualified to provide it. This pattern connects to something that shows up repeatedly throughout every story involving Peter's relationship with his children. Whether the situation involves a missed vaccine, a financial debt turned into a contract, a home invasion, a supernatural crisis, or a kidnapping far from home, Peter consistently avoids taking real, direct responsibility for protecting his children when it actually matters most. In this particular story, that avoidance takes its most dangerous form yet, since it involves an actual medical emergency requiring professional care. And Peter's response is not simply to do nothing, it is to actively create additional danger, using his own injured baby as part of an elaborate scheme specifically designed to protect himself from consequences, rather than to protect Stewie from further harm. The severity of this particular failure stands apart from the earlier examples covered throughout this story, because of how directly it threatens Stewie's actual physical well-being. A missed vaccine involves a choice made in advance that leads to consequences down the line. A financial debt involves poor planning that leads to a bad solution. A home invasion and a haunted house both involve dangerous situations that Peter fails to handle responsibly once they are already happening. This story involves something different entirely, since Peter is not simply failing to prevent danger or failing to respond well to a crisis that develops on its own. He is actively choosing to extend and worsen a dangerous medical situation, using deception and manipulation specifically to avoid facing the consequences of his own poor judgment, even when doing so means putting his own baby son at continued risk. This story also reveals something troubling about how normalized this kind of behavior has apparently become within the Griffin household. Peter's casual admission that he handled Meg and Chris's injuries the same way in the past suggests that concealing serious harm rather than seeking real help has become something close to standard practice for him whenever one of his children gets hurt under circumstances that might make him look responsible or careless. Rather than each incident serving as a lesson that pushes him toward better judgment the next time something similar happens, the pattern simply repeats itself, carried forward from one child to the next, without any real change in how Peter chooses to respond. Stewie eventually recovers from his injury, though the story does not focus heavily on exactly how that recovery unfolds once the immediate crisis passes. What remains clear throughout this entire sequence of events is that his recovery happens despite Peter's choices, rather than because of any responsible action taken on his part. The severe head injury that could have used proper medical treatment from the very beginning instead gets buried under layers of concealment, disguise, and eventually a second dangerous incident involving a moving vehicle, all orchestrated specifically to protect Peter from having to admit what actually happened. Looking at everything this story reveals about Peter as a father, the picture that emerges is one of a man who treats his own children's serious injuries as problems to be managed and hidden, rather than emergencies requiring real, immediate attention. His established pattern of doing this across multiple children, combined with his willingness to create new danger specifically to maintain his cover-up, shows a level of disregard for his children's physical safety that goes beyond simple negligence. It shows a father who has built an entire, repeated system around avoiding responsibility whenever something serious happens under his watch, choosing deception over honesty and concealment over proper care. Every single time the situation calls for him to step up and make the right decision for his child's actual well-being. Stewie survives this ordeal. The truth about the car incident presumably never fully reaches Lois in any way that holds Peter accountable for what he orchestrated. And life in the Griffin household moves forward without any real reckoning for a pattern of behavior that had apparently already repeated itself at least twice before this particular incident with Stewie ever took place. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same instinct to avoid taking real responsibility for a child's well-being would show up again in an entirely different form before long. This time with Peter not covering up an accident, but actively choosing to bond with Stewie over something that should never have been treated as bonding at all, while an entirely different kind of danger crept in around Chris without either parent noticing it was even happening. Section 8. Bonding over the wrong things. The episode The Courtship of Stewie's Father, which aired on Fox on November 20th, 2005, shows a completely different kind of parenting failure from anything covered so far. This is not a story about carelessness leading to an accident, or about a father failing to notice danger that develops on its own. This is a story about what Peter actively chooses to teach his own baby son, and what he fails to notice happening to his teenage son at the exact same time. Two separate storylines run through this episode, and together they show a father who spends his attention on exactly the wrong things, while real harm quietly takes shape right in front of him. The main storyline centers on Peter discovering something about Stewie that most parents would find deeply concerning rather than something worth celebrating. Peter realizes that Stewie genuinely enjoys watching Lois get hurt, finding real amusement in moments where his own mother experiences pain or embarrassment, rather than seeing this as a warning sign, something that might call for a serious conversation about kindness, empathy, or basic respect toward other people. Peter treats this discovery as an exciting opportunity. He sees a shared interest between himself and his infant son, something he can use to finally build the kind of closeness with Stewie that he has struggled to find up to this point. Setting the stage for what follows requires understanding just how far Peter takes this newly discovered connection. Rather than gently redirecting Stewie away from finding entertainment in his mother's suffering, Peter leans directly into it, actively encouraging the behavior and participating alongside him. What starts as a father noticing an unusual trait in his baby quickly turns into the two of them working together, treating Lois as a source of entertainment rather than someone who deserves basic respect and care from her own husband and son. The rising tension in this story builds through a series of increasingly harsh pranks and cruel jokes that Peter and Stewie carry out together at Lois's expense. These moments escalate well beyond harmless teasing, moving into territory that causes Lois real physical discomfort and genuine distress. The bonding between father and son grows stronger with each new prank, built entirely on a foundation of shared amusement over someone else's pain, specifically the pain of a woman who is supposed to be protected and respected by both of them. The high moment of this storyline arrives when Peter and Stewie's behavior toward Lois reaches its most extreme point. The two of them lock Lois inside the trunk of her own car, then push the vehicle into a lake with her still trapped inside. This moment stands out as one of the clearest examples throughout the entire episode of how far this bonding experience has gone. Rather than a light-hearted joke or a moment of mild embarrassment, this is a genuinely dangerous situation, one that puts Lois's actual safety at risk, trapping her inside a sinking vehicle with no easy way to escape on her own. Peter and Stewie's reaction to this moment is not concern or fear for what they have done. It is uncontrollable laughter, treating a moment of real danger to someone they are both supposed to love and protect as the funniest part of their entire bonding experience. What makes this moment especially troubling is not simply that it happens, but what it teaches Stewie about how to treat people, and specifically how to treat his own mother. Rather than learning that hurting someone, even in the name of a joke, crosses a serious line, Stewie learns the exact opposite lesson from his own father. He learns that causing real harm to Lois is something worth doing, something that brings him closer to Peter, something that earns him laughter and approval rather than any kind of correction or consequence. This lesson comes directly from the one person who is supposed to be teaching Stewie the difference between right and wrong. And instead, Peter uses this moment to reinforce exactly the wrong values in his own son. The fallout from this particular storyline shows Lois surviving the ordeal in the lake, but the larger fallout runs deeper than the physical danger of that single moment. Peter has spent this entire storyline actively strengthening a bond with Stewie built on cruelty toward Lois, treating her suffering as the foundation for their father-son relationship, rather than something either of them should feel any responsibility to prevent. This pattern reveals a father who, when finally given the chance to connect with a child he has struggled to bond with, chooses to build that connection on the worst possible foundation available to him, rather than looking for any other shared interest that might not involve deliberately hurting someone else in the household. While this entire storyline plays out between Peter and Stewie, a second and far more serious situation unfolds involving Chris, one that receives almost no attention from Peter throughout the episode, because his focus remains entirely locked onto his newfound bonding experience with the baby. Herbert, an older neighbor who lives near the Griffins, begins showing an unusual and inappropriate level of interest in Chris throughout this episode. Herbert's attention toward Chris in this story follows a pattern the show has used before to signal deeply uncomfortable and predatory behavior, presenting Herbert's interest in spending time with Chris in ways that go well beyond what any responsible adult neighbor should be doing with a teenage boy who is not his own child. Setting the stage for why this situation becomes so dangerous requires recognizing exactly where Peter's attention sits during this same period of time. He is not paying close attention to what Chris is doing or who he is spending time with because his focus remains completely absorbed in his bonding experience with Stewie, an experience built around pranking and endangering Lois. This means that at the exact moment when Chris needs a parent paying enough attention to notice that something troubling is happening, with a neighbor showing this kind of interest in him, Peter is nowhere near attentive enough to catch it. His attention is elsewhere entirely, focused on something that is itself deeply inappropriate, leaving a real gap in supervision at the exact moment his teenage son needs it most. This creates a troubling contrast between the two storylines running through the same episode. On one side, Peter actively participates in dangerous, harmful behavior with Stewie, fully aware of what he is doing and treating it as something worth celebrating. On the other side, an actual predatory threat develops around Chris, and Peter remains completely unaware of it, not because he has any reason to trust the situation, but because he simply is not paying attention to his son at all during this period. Both situations point to the same underlying problem: a father who fails to provide the kind of attentive, protective presence his children need, whether that failure shows up through active participation in harmful behavior or through simple absence at a moment when real danger is quietly developing. The rising tension around Chris's situation builds through Herbert's continued attempts to get closer to him, spending time with him in ways that repeatedly raise questions about his true intentions. The show frames Herbert's behavior throughout this storyline in a way meant to make the audience deeply uncomfortable, presenting his interest in Chris as something clearly inappropriate for an adult neighbor to show toward a teenage boy. Yet within the world of the show, none of the adults who should be paying attention seem to notice or intervene in any meaningful way. at least not through Peter's own actions during this particular episode. Looking at what this reveals about Chris specifically, the situation shows a teenage boy left vulnerable to an adult's inappropriate attention simply because the person responsible for watching out for him is too consumed with something else entirely to notice what is happening right in front of him. Chris does not receive protection from his father in this moment, not because Peter makes a conscious decision to ignore a threat he recognizes, but because he never even reaches the point of recognizing it in the first place. His attention is elsewhere, wrapped up in cruelty toward Lois, leaving Chris to navigate an uncomfortable and inappropriate situation with an adult neighbor largely on his own. The fallout from this second storyline within the episode reveals just how disconnected Peter's priorities are from what his children actually need from him during this period. He spends the episode building a bond with Stewie, rooted in shared cruelty, actively endangering Lois in the process, while his teenage son deals with an inappropriate situation involving an adult neighbor almost entirely without his father's awareness or involvement. Neither situations receives the kind of parental attention that would normally be expected from someone responsible for the safety and well-being of both children. Zooming out to consider the bigger picture this episode reveals, the most troubling detail is not simply that Peter fails to notice what is happening with Chris. It is what he chooses to focus on instead. This is not a story about a father distracted by work, financial stress, or some other reasonable, if still concerning reason for missing what is happening with his son. He is distracted specifically because he is actively engaged in harmful behavior with his other child, treating cruelty toward Lois as quality bonding time. His attention is not simply absent, it is actively misdirected toward something that itself represents a serious failure in how he treats his family. This pattern connects to something seen across many of the other stories covered throughout this series, where Peter's failures as a father often come from where he chooses to place his focus, rather than a complete lack of engagement with his children altogether. He is not disconnected from Stewie in this episode. If anything, he is deeply engaged with him, spending real time and effort building a connection between them. The problem is not the presence or absence of attention itself, but the direction that attention takes. Choosing to bond with Stewie over cruelty toward Lois represents an active, deliberate choice about what kind of relationship he wants to build with his son, one that teaches harmful values rather than healthy ones. And that same choice to invest energy in the wrong place leaves nothing left over for noticing a genuine threat developing around Chris at the exact same time. This episode also reveals something important about how Peter's failures with one child can create ripple effects that harm another child entirely. Stewie does not simply learn to enjoy hurting Lois in isolation from everything else happening in the household. The time and energy Peter pours into building that particular bond comes directly at the expense of attention that could have gone toward noticing what Herbert was doing around Chris. Every moment Peter spends laughing with Stewie about Lois's suffering is a moment he is not spending paying attention to whether his teenage son is safe from an adult neighbor's inappropriate interest. These two storylines are not simply happening at the same time by coincidence within the structure of the episode. They exist as two sides of the same underlying problem. A father who consistently fails to direct his time and attention toward the things that actually matter for his children's safety and well-being. The resolution of Lois's situation, surviving the lake incident despite the danger Peter and Stewie put her through, does nothing to address the deeper lesson that Stewie takes away from the entire experience. He has learned, directly from his own father, that hurting someone can be a source of connection and laughter, rather than something requiring guilt or correction. This lesson does not disappear once the immediate danger of the lake passes. It becomes part of how Stewie understands his relationship with his father going forward, built on a foundation that no responsible parent should ever want to establish with a child. Similarly, The situation involving Chris and Herbert does not resolve through any direct action Peter takes to protect his son or address what has been happening around him. The episode simply moves through its events without Peter ever fully grasping the seriousness of what his teenage son has been dealing with throughout the story, because his attention never turns in that direction long enough to notice. This leaves Chris in a position where the adult who is supposed to be watching out for him remains almost entirely unaware of a genuinely troubling situation happening right in his own neighborhood. This story stands apart from earlier examples covered throughout this series because it shows two distinct forms of parental failure happening within the very same episode, each one making the other worse simply by existing at the same time. Peter is not failing Stewie and Chris in the exact same way. With Stewie, he actively participates in and encourages harmful behavior, treating cruelty as bonding. With Chris, he simply fails to notice a real threat because his focus sits elsewhere. Both failures point back to the same core problem: a father whose priorities consistently point away from the actual needs of his children, whether that means teaching them the wrong lessons directly or leaving them exposed to danger through simple inattention. Taken together, these two storylines paint a picture of a household where a father's presence does not guarantee safety or good guidance for his children. Being physically present and even deeply engaged with one child does not mean the rest of the family receives the attention or protection they need. In this particular episode, Peter's presence with Stewie actively works against the family's well-being, teaching harmful lessons and endangering Lois, while his absence in noticing what is happening with Chris leaves a real gap where protection should have existed. Neither version of Peter's involvement, whether too focused in the wrong direction or not focused enough in the right one, ends up serving his children the way a responsible parent should. Life in the Griffin household continues forward from this episode without any lasting acknowledgement of either failure. Lois recovers from the lake incident. Stewie carries forward the lessons he learned about finding humor in someone else's suffering. And Chris continues living in the same neighborhood as Herbert without his father ever fully recognizing the discomfort his son experienced throughout this entire story. Both situations fade into the background of daily life, treated as though nothing particularly significant happened, even though one storyline involved teaching a baby cruelty toward his own mother, and the other involved a teenage boy left exposed to an adult's troubling attention, because nobody was paying close enough attention to notice. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same tendency to misdirect his focus toward the wrong things would show up again in an entirely different setting, this time not through cruelty aimed at Lois, but through Peter's complete unwillingness to actually listen to what one of his own sons was trying to tell him, choosing instead to push his own expectations onto a child who wanted something completely different for himself. Section 9. The Son Nobody Bothered to Listen to. The episode The Sun Also Draws, which originally aired on Fox on May 9, 1999, tells a story that looks, on the surface, like it ends on a positive note. Peter and Chris do eventually reach a moment of understanding by the time the episode wraps up, but reaching that moment requires an entire storyline built around Peter refusing to listen to his own son again and again, until circumstances completely outside of his control finally force him to pay attention. This story shows a different kind of failure than physical danger or careless neglect. It shows a father who has already decided what he wants his son to be, and who spends most of the episode unwilling to hear anything that might contradict that picture. The trouble begins with Chris and his time in the Youth Scouts, the show's own version of a real youth organization built around outdoor activities, badges, and troop leadership. Chris has been part of this group for 2 years by the time this episode takes place. Yet, in all that time, he has not earned a single merit badge, the kind of recognition scouts typically receive for completing different skills and activities. This detail matters because it shows that Chris has clearly not been thriving within the structure of the scouts, going through the motions for 2 full years without gaining any of the markers of progress the organization is built around. The reason behind this lack of progress becomes clear once the show reveals what Chris actually wants to spend his time doing. Rather than participating fully in scout activities, Chris would much rather sit off to the side and draw, spending his energy on art instead of the outdoor tasks and physical activities that scouting expects from its members. This is not laziness or a lack of interest in doing anything at all. Chris has a clear passion, drawing, that simply does not line up with what the scouts are asking him to do. Rather than recognizing this and supporting Chris in finding an activity that actually suits him, the show sets up a situation where Chris feels trapped between what he wants to do and what he believes his father expects from him. Setting the stage for how deep this problem runs requires looking at how long Chris has apparently been trying to communicate his true feelings without success. Throughout the episode, Chris makes multiple attempts to tell Peter that he does not want to be in the Scouts anymore, hoping to finally get the message across that his heart has never really been in this activity. Each time, something interferes with the conversation before Chris can actually get the words out. Sometimes, he simply fails to find the right moment to bring it up. Other times, Peter interrupts him before he can finish, moving the conversation somewhere else entirely without ever realizing what his son was trying to tell him. This pattern repeats throughout the episode, showing a communication breakdown that exists specifically because Peter is not creating space for Chris to speak honestly, and because Chris himself feels enough uncertainty about how his father might react that he struggles to push through and say what he actually means. The rising tension in this story builds toward a breaking point that finally forces the issue into the open, though not through any conversation Chris manages to have with his father directly. During a soapbox derby event connected to the Scouts, an activity involving small engine-free vehicles that participants race down a track, Chris ends up running over the troop leader with his car. This incident, combined with his complete lack of progress over the past 2 years and his general lack of enthusiasm for scouting activities, finally gives the troop leader enough reason to remove Chris from the organization entirely. Chris gets kicked out of the Youth Scouts, an outcome that could have been avoided through a simple, honest conversation with his father much earlier, but instead arrives through an accident that forces the issue rather than an open discussion that could have handled it far more gently. What happens next reveals exactly how little Peter has actually been listening to his son throughout this entire situation. Rather than seeing Chris's expulsion from the Scouts as an opportunity to finally ask what he actually wants, or as confirmation of something Chris may have been trying to tell him all along, Peter reacts with frustration directed at the Scout leader rather than any real curiosity about his son's feelings. He becomes upset that Chris was removed so abruptly, treating the expulsion itself as the problem, rather than considering whether Chris even wanted to remain in the Scouts in the first place. This reaction shows that Peter's focus throughout this entire storyline has never actually been about what makes Chris happy or what activities genuinely interest him. His focus is on maintaining the version of Chris that fits scouting, regardless of whether that version reflects what his son actually wants for himself. Rather than accepting the expulsion and using it as a chance to talk with Chris about other interests, Peter decides the family needs to travel to Scout headquarters in Manhattan to argue for Chris's reinstatement, essentially fighting to put his son back into an activity Chris has been quietly trying to escape from for the better part of 2 years. This decision puts the entire family on a road trip specifically built around undoing something that, from Chris's perspective, should never have needed undoing in the first place. Peter is not driving toward Manhattan because Chris asked him to. He is driving there because he has decided, on his own, without ever truly hearing his son's side of things, that getting Chris back into scouting is the right outcome to pursue. The high moment of tension in this story does not come from a dramatic confrontation, but from how completely sidetracked the family's priorities become once they stop along the way at a casino run by a Native American tribe. What begins as a simple rest stop during the drive to Manhattan quickly spirals into an entirely separate crisis as Lois becomes captivated by the slot machines inside the casino and develops a serious gambling habit over the course of just this one stop. Her behavior escalates to the point where she ends up betting the family car itself, losing it entirely to the casino in the process. This detail matters because it shows exactly how easily the family's attention shifts away from Chris and his actual situation the moment something else, in this case, Lois's sudden gambling problem, demands more immediate attention. Rather than the family focusing on getting Chris reinstated, or better yet, having an honest conversation with him about whether reinstatement is even something he wants, the entire trip gets consumed by the fallout from Lois losing the car. Peter now finds himself trying to solve an entirely different problem, one he needs to fix quickly if the family has any hope of continuing toward their original destination. Chris's actual feelings about scouting, the entire reason for this trip in the first place, fade into the background almost completely, replaced by a scramble to recover the family's transportation from a casino Peter never intended to stop at in the first place. In order to try to win back the car, Peter claims that he has Native American heritage, hoping this claim might give the family some kind of advantage or entitlement within the casino's ownership structure. This claim gets challenged immediately, and rather than being taken at his word, Peter ends up being sent on a vision quest, a traditional spiritual journey meant to test and prove his claimed heritage, guided loosely by casino staff, who seem more interested in testing him than actually helping him. Chris ends up accompanying Peter on this journey into the surrounding woods, walking alongside his father as he attempts to prove something about his identity that likely was never true to begin with. It is only here, deep into a vision quest that has nothing directly to do with scouting, art, or anything Chris originally wanted to discuss with his father, that Chris finally manages to say what he has been trying to say throughout the entire episode. Away from the pressure of home, away from the scout headquarters they were originally traveling toward, and away from any expectation tied to reinstatement, Chris tells Peter directly that he does not like being in the Scouts, and that he would much rather spend his time drawing instead. This moment lands only because the two of them happen to be isolated together in the woods, with nothing else competing for Peter's attention in that particular moment. A stark contrast to every earlier attempt Chris made back home, where distractions, interruptions, and Peter's own assumptions kept getting in the way. Peter's response to finally hearing this, once he actually stops long enough to listen, turns out to be understanding rather than resistance. He accepts what Chris tells him, acknowledging his son's talent for drawing and letting go of his earlier insistence on getting him back into an activity Chris never wanted to be part of in the first place. On its own, this moment might look like a genuine turning point, a father finally coming around to support his son's real interests. But the way this understanding arrives says just as much about Peter's earlier failures as it does about his eventual acceptance. It takes a lost car, a fake vision quest, and complete physical isolation from every distraction back home before Peter finally creates enough space to hear what Chris had been trying to tell him the entire time. The fallout from this entire sequence of events reveals something important about how conditional Peter's attention toward Chris really is throughout most of this story. He does not seek out a quiet moment with his son early on to ask how he feels about scouting. He does not notice, on his own, that 2 years without a single badge might signal a lack of genuine interest. He only reaches real understanding once external circumstances, a stolen car, a fake spiritual journey, and complete isolation from anything else demanding his attention essentially force the conversation to happen in a setting where nothing else can interrupt it. Zooming out to consider what this reveals about Peter as a father, the most important detail is not the eventual moment of acceptance in the woods, but everything that happens before it. His initial reaction to Chris's expulsion focuses on his own frustration rather than any curiosity about his son's actual feelings. His decision to fight for reinstatement comes entirely from his own assumptions about what Chris should want, never from anything Chris directly asked him to do. And throughout the entire build-up to this journey, Chris's repeated attempts to speak honestly get pushed aside, not through any cruelty on Peter's part, but through simple inattention. A father who is too locked into his own expectations to notice his son trying to reach him. This pattern connects to something seen throughout many of the other stories covered across this project, where Peter's failures as a father often come from where he chooses to direct his attention rather than any complete absence of caring altogether. He is not indifferent to Chris throughout this episode, in the way he sometimes appears indifferent to Meg's safety in other stories. He actively wants Chris back in the Scouts, driving the family across state lines to make that happen. But that active effort is aimed at fixing a version of Chris that exists only in Peter's own mind, built around an activity his son never truly enjoyed, rather than aimed at understanding what Chris genuinely wants for himself. Effort without listening does not amount to real attentiveness, and this episode shows exactly how far that kind of effort can miss the mark when it comes from assumptions rather than actual conversation. The detail about Chris going 2 full years without earning a single badge deserves closer attention within this larger picture, since it shows just how long this disconnect between Chris's real feelings and Peter's expectations had already been building before the events of this specific episode even took place. This was not a sudden change of heart on Chris's part, discovered only recently. It was a pattern stretching back a significant length of time, one that either went unnoticed by Peter entirely, or one that Peter noticed and simply failed to ask about, choosing instead to keep pushing Chris toward reinstatement the moment the expulsion happened, rather than reflecting on what 2 years of struggle inside the organization might actually mean. Comparing this story to the earlier disaster at the casino also reveals something telling about how quickly Peter's attention shifts once something new grabs his focus. The entire purpose of the road trip, getting Chris reinstated into the Scouts, gets pushed almost entirely out of view the moment Lois starts losing money at the slot machines. If reinstatement truly mattered as much to Peter as his initial reaction suggested, the family's sudden detour into solving a gambling problem should have felt like a frustrating distraction from the real goal. Instead, it becomes the dominant storyline for a significant stretch of the episode, showing that Peter's attention was never as firmly focused on Chris's situation as his initial anger at the Scout leader might have suggested. His focus moves easily from one problem to the next, rarely staying locked onto what Chris actually needs from him for very long. The eventual bonding moment between Peter and Chris in the woods, while genuine within the context of that specific scene, does not erase the pattern that led up to it. A father who truly listens to his children does not need a lost car and a fake spiritual test to finally hear what his son has been trying to say for the entire length of an episode, let alone for 2 years leading up to it. The fact that understanding only arrives once every other distraction has been stripped away says something important about how easily Chris's voice gets lost whenever anything else, whether it is Peter's own assumptions or an entirely unrelated crisis involving Lois, happens to be competing for attention at the same time. This story adds a distinct piece to the larger picture of how Peter operates as a father, showing that his failures do not only appear through physical neglect or active cruelty. Sometimes they appear through a simple unwillingness or inability to actually hear what his own children are telling him, even when they try more than once to get the message across. Chris is not silent throughout this episode. He makes multiple attempts to communicate honestly with his father, and each attempt gets lost, not through malice, but through Peter's own distraction and his firm attachment to an idea of who Chris should be, one built around scouting rather than art. By the time the episode ends, Peter and Chris reach a place of mutual understanding, with Peter finally recognizing his son's talent and letting go of his push for reinstatement into an activity Chris never truly wanted to be part of. This resolution offers a moment of real connection between them, but it arrives only after an entire chain of missed conversations, misplaced priorities, and outside distractions that had nothing directly to do with what Chris actually needed from his father. The understanding they reached together in the woods does not undo the 2 years Chris spent quietly unhappy in an activity nobody bothered to ask him about. Nor does it erase the repeated moments earlier in the episode where his attempts to speak honestly simply went unheard. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same tendency to only notice what truly matters to one of his children, once everything else has been stripped away, would resurface again in a much more troubling form. Rather than involving art or scouting, it would center on money, inheritance, and a decision so far outside normal parenting that it would make even his failure to listen to Chris in this episode look almost gentle by comparison. Section 10. The inheritance he wanted for himself. The episode Fresh Air, which aired on Fox on March 23, 2014, brings this entire pattern of failed parenting to its most extreme point. Every earlier story in this series showed Peter falling short as a father in different ways, through carelessness, neglect, cover-ups, or simply failing to listen. This episode takes things much further, showing Peter willing to exploit his own son in a scheme built entirely around money, jealousy, and his own wounded pride. The story begins with Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's wealthy father, who has never had much respect for Peter and rarely misses a chance to make that clear. After suffering an injury, breaking his leg while trying to walk up a down escalator at the mall, Carter needs someone to look after him while his wife Babs travels out of town. Lois cannot take on the responsibility herself, and Meg refuses outright, leaving Chris as the only person left in the family available to step in and help. Setting the stage for what follows requires understanding how unexpected this arrangement turns out to be. Chris and Carter, who have never been particularly close, end up getting along far better than anyone in the family expected. They spend real time together, playing music, ordering food, and building a genuine connection neither of them anticipated. This bond grows strong enough that Carter makes a decision that changes everything for the rest of the episode. Rather than leaving his fortune to Lois, or even considering Peter in any capacity, Carter decides that Chris will be the one to inherit his wealth. The rising tension in this story comes directly from Peter's reaction to this decision. Rather than feeling happy that his son has formed a genuine relationship with his grandfather, or recognizing that Chris earned this outcome through real connection rather than manipulation, Peter becomes consumed with resentment. He wanted that inheritance for himself, and watching it go to Chris instead triggers a level of jealousy that pushes him toward increasingly desperate behavior throughout the rest of the episode. The high moment of this story arrives once Peter decides that the only way to keep the family fortune within his own control is to find a legal way to claim it directly from Chris. Within the world of this show, A specific loophole exists that gives Peter exactly the opening he is looking for. In the state of Vermont, marriage between a father and his son is treated as legal within the exaggerated logic of the story. Rather than dismissing this as an absurd and inappropriate idea the moment it crosses his mind, Peter decides to actually pursue it, tricking Chris into traveling to Vermont with him under false pretenses, all so he can propose marriage to his own son using Lois's own ring, purely as a means of gaining legal access to Carter's fortune. This decision represents a complete abandonment of any normal boundary between father and son. Peter is not doing this because he mistakenly believes it will help Chris in any way. He is doing it entirely for his own financial gain, treating his son's autonomy, dignity, and basic well-being as something that can be sacrificed the moment it stands between Peter and money he never actually earned or was ever entitled to receive. Chris is deceived into this situation without any real understanding of what his father is actually planning, manipulated into a trip that has nothing to do with spending genuine time together, and everything to do with Peter's own greed. The fallout from this scheme grows even darker once the details of how far Peter is willing to go become clear. Rather than his plan involving deception alone, Peter's path toward gaining access to Carter's fortune involves causing real harm along the way, including the death of a child, as part of the twisted logic Peter follows in pursuing this inheritance. This detail places the episode among the darkest examples covered throughout this entire series, since it moves beyond emotional neglect or careless endangerment into something that treats human life as an obstacle standing between Peter and money he wants purely for himself. Zooming out to consider what this episode reveals about Peter as a father, the picture that emerges is the most extreme version of everything shown across every other story in this project. Earlier failures involved forgetting a vaccine, creating debt through carelessness, treating a daughter's safety as secondary to convenience, or failing to notice real danger because his attention sat elsewhere. This story removes any remaining doubt about how far Peter is willing to go when something he wants stands in his way. His own son becomes a tool in a scheme built entirely around jealousy and greed, deceived into a situation that treats his identity and his relationship with his father as nothing more than a means to an inheritance Peter never earned in the first place. Chris spent this episode doing nothing wrong. He simply built a real, caring relationship with his grandfather, something that should have been celebrated by every member of his family, rather than punished by the one person who was supposed to be proudest of him. Instead, that connection became the very reason his own father tried to manipulate him into something no son should ever have to face. All because Peter could not stand watching someone else, even his own child, receive something he believed should have been his. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.